So kami pala talaga dito yung pioneer eh. Sabi namin ano kaya tong lugar na to, what a place is this? Sabi namin eh, walang ilaw, walang tubig. Tapos yun nangarap nga kami, sabi ko sana Lord, magkaroon kami ng tubig, tapos magkaroon na kami ng kuryente. So ngayon ang ginawa namin, pag sinabing bayanihan, bayanihan lahat. Tulong-tulong tayo.
Bayanihan has a sort of romanticized, idealized vision now. And when you get to various rural areas, then the term is much more specific.
Bayanihan ang tawag dito sa mutual work. And then sa probinsya, kadalasan tinatawag namin as saranay.
Marcos and his ideas of new society, I think, is the first president to really capitalize on that kind of phenomena. And so his vision of the new society had this corporatist element, and one of it was an idealized rural community.
There are traditions of mutual support existing in most countries around the world. Where I come from in Norway, it's called dugnad, and here in Philippines, it's called
bayanihan. It's a very human tradition that comes out as a natural response to do something together. The traditions of dugnad and bayanihan are contextual representations or expressions of that phenomena.
Sa aming pagkakaintindi at sa aming experience, taus-pusong tulong handog o di kaya'y kusang loob na pagtulong na walang inaasahang katumbas.
Yeah, I'm sorry, again, I'm not one of these romanticized people who see this great, huge sort of outpouring of love. I think most Filipinos are practical people. Like most people around the world, they calculate what is best for them and their families. If that involves forms of reciprocity, then they will engage with.
What happens if one family doesn't pitch in?
It's okay. We don't force them if they don't have enough or if they don't want to.
One interpretation in terms of how this virtue came about was by virtue of the geography of the Philippines. We live in the Typhoon Belt and the Pacific Ring of Fire. The country is very much used to disasters.
Sometimes, challenges are the weather. May mga sakuna, sobrang init, umuulan, bumabagyo. But dahil nga sama-sama kami, masaya yung pagbabayanihan.
Dealing with threats and risk as a community is an important element of the way Filipino societies have evolved. If that is the concept, to what extent does risk and threat actually drive community spirit in the Philippines?
So bayanihan really is a product of the circumstances that we are forced to live in, whether it's disasters, whether it's armed conflict. The structures that the Filipinos are experiencing every day demands that we help each other in order to survive.
Development in general has two meanings to it. One is about the process of transition or transformation. And at the same time, it is about measurement of our quality of life, mainly about economic development. As a result, the inequalities in societies were not addressed. So there were a lot of questioning coming from especially grassroots movements. And that is the beginning of alternative development that disengages from this top-down Western-centric approach.
People who don't have a lot in terms of wealth or capital, finding in forms of solidarity a way of actually dealing with the environment in which they live in.
So ayun, ako po si Sudar Kadka ulit, si Alex Furunes. Yung title po ng project natin ay Structures of Mutual Support. Nagsulat po kami ng maliit na proposal, sinabit po namin sa NCCA, tapos ito po ay na-select. Tapos isasama po siya sa isang exhibition na tinatawag po na Biennale Arkitektura. Tapos yung tema ng buong exhibition na yon ay How Will We Live Together? Meaning, paano po tayo mabubuhay ng sama-sama at sabay-sabay?
How do you use mutual support in the context of an architectural project? Like traditionally, it was also used to build houses, but we want to structure this so that actually the process also generates a shared idea or ambition for what we're creating. So we have a process that we call learning, questioning, making, concept design, and build.
So the interesting thing also we're trying to do with this exhibition is we're trying to tap into that spirit or that phenomena or that idea of mutual support, to be able to engage responsibly or cohesively with the communities. So yung activity natin today, tinatawag natin siyang programming activity. Ano yung mga malapit sa puso natin, na values natin. Kailangan lahat yun may pagsasama-sama natin para maging isang gusali.
In the learning phase, we try to understand a little bit more how do we actually live together? What are our ambitions? What's important for us?
With that structure, we held activities that aim to get at particular topics which are relevant with the communities.
Okay po yan. Okay lang po yan. So, nag-drawing ako ng isang skeleton building para may pakita na kailangan natin ng trabaho.
Architecture is a field that's often equated to expertise. But what this project demonstrates is that for a very technical field, it's not enough to just have the competence of experts. Why? Because experts don't know what people need. Experts don't know how people live. This is why it's important to bring in the voices of people who will actually use whatever structure architects create.
It's interesting to work with the different age groups separately and producing material with each group separately. That means that we can actually work first with the parents and then with the kids, and then we can swap material. And that brings a different perspective on the material that we're working with.
Ito yung parang malawak na idea natin tungkol sa kung ano ba talaga yung kailangan natin gawin. Tapos unti-unti na natin siyang ina-narrow down para maging final, kumbaga.
So choosing a project is not easy. There are many different competing interests, and communities will always have a lot of different ideas. What's important about the workshop is that it facilitated a process of public justification.
Kaya hindi pantay ang level ng buhay. Merong mahirap, merong mayaman.
We were able to discuss a little bit about the problems that they experience, the roots of those problems, and then the effects of those problems. We were already beginning to get at an understanding of how those problems might be solved by an architectural intervention.
How do we live with each other? So civic relationships build an obligation for us to explain why we choose to do a certain way when we relate to our neighbors.
Baka meron kang may share na anong idea na pwede natin itayo.
Baka may suggestion kayo na gusto nyong mangyari sa adult and sa kabataan.
Kailangan ko yung para sa mga bata, para hindi na sila lumalabas, dito na lang tayo magpatayo ng palaruan.
We aim to kind of compile all of the findings into what kind of program this building would contain, which became eventually a library and a hangout space at Tambayan.
Anong qualities ng library? Kunyari kung sarado o kung open para sa lahat, kung
Open
ano
para
ganon.
sa lahat, syempre.
Open para sa lahat.
Ano yun? Importante yun para sa mga bata, sa mga pag-aaral nila.
Tulad mo.
There's also another aspect here which is interesting because they also brought up this concept of maliwalas, right? Yes. They kept talking about maliwalas.
Maaliwalas na pag tinignan yung buhay na tulad.
Kahit simple lang, basta maaliwalas din yun. Malinis.
Maaliwalas is a Filipino concept of space. It embodies all the perceived good qualities of space that we like. It captures the feeling of openness, of light, of brightness, of freshness, of ventilation, of air. So all those good qualities are captured within this one word called maaliwalas. May ideas tayo makukuha sa mga ganyan klaseng. Nakita niyo naman yung naging final natin na window, di ba? Nag-map tayo ng mga doors and windows sa surrounding community natin, and then tinignan natin kung ano yung naging impact niya sa idea ng maaliwalas. Pero so nakita niyo yung pinag-usapan natin yung puso nun, yung pinag-usapan natin, nandiyan naman.
So the dynamics here between the grid and maliwalas, that's really where the discussion allowed us to create the building that we now have.
What I find so interesting is another one of the ways in which Filipino societies have adapted is in their architecture, and is an incredibly interesting form of adaptive architecture in which the Baha'i Kubo forms a sort of basis of it, but it's actually built in hard materials on the bottom floor and then on light materials on the upper floor.
It's a mechanism of resilience, basically. As architects, we can have a lot to say in terms of the resiliency of the built structure itself really shows that the design itself has a major role in, in the way that you actually work with the environment rather than against it.
What we're trying to do then is trying to create the frameworks by which resilience can occur between the community and the built environment and how that all affects each other. Those things really highlight this idea that there is some resilience that's part of this whole architectural process.
Dito tayo
Kasi ito yung puno eh.
isa rito yung dahil dito yung pinto.
Nag-decidean po namin na sa malapit sa court ilagay dahil malapit sa community. So pagka tiningnan po namin yung structure, makikita namin na naging part kami ng pagbuo. So masayang-masaya po kami na naging parte kami ng proyekto.
The most impressive kinds of modern architecture I've seen in the Philippines is ones that actually still try to retain that kind of, use the Baha'i Kubo as a sort of basis of a modern kind of architectural expressions.
If we really ground the process in democratic participation by the people and people deciding the priorities for themselves instead of being told by others, I think that is the way we can actually make a real difference to development.
Deliberative democracy is a vision of society where decision-making is sensitive to good reasons. Even the poorest communities, those who have very little education, when given the opportunity to express their reasons and justify to each other, then these decisions take off. And the outcome here is a project that is legitimate. It's a project that the community feels they have ownership. It's a product of a series of decisions that they made as a community.
Ano yung 3 by?
3 by 8.
3 by 8.
Dito po galing hangin
Pag ganyan.
When we focus on participation as an integral part of development, it really changes the role of the community, and they cannot be a passive receiver of aid.
I would see that as an expression of community development, another form of reciprocity, and not just simply people helping each other, but thinking about how you adapt the built environment around to actually facilitate living.
That's why I'm making an argument to democratize bayanihan, to create structures that encourages communities who otherwise would not engage each other to think about how these structures of mutual aid and support can be regularized so no one is left behind.
I think that biggest advantage of these mutual support traditions is that it's something that is already part of people's experience. In order to connect this back to a bigger development discussion, it has to allow a way of framing development through pluralistic terms. So it cannot be one solution for all countries.
So yung una is, tingin nyo ba na-represent ng building yung mga values ninyo?
Sa kabuuan, yung unity, yung pagkakaisa.
Pagkakaisa.
Yun ang ano doon.
Hindi lang yung project nyo ang nabigyang pansin, kundi nabigyang pansin din yung personalidad ng bawat isa dito sa community.
At saka parang lumabas na andun yung bayanihan talaga. Hiningi nyo yung mga opinion namin. Samantalang mataas naman kayo kami, dito lang. Pero malaking bagay yun na ikinatutuwa rin namin na inano nyo yung mga suggestion namin.
Nagtiwala kayo sa amin.
Nagtiwala kayo.
I think the Philippines has a culture that is consistent with principles of deliberative democracy. I think there is something about the way we relate to each other that makes the country ready for this kind of democratic process.
Through this Biennale project parang na-experience namin kung paano maging architect. Nagkaroon kami ng ideya. We are also learning.
Sabi nga ng iba, kung talagang mahal mo siya, hayaan mo.
Madami namang lugar at madaming community na pwedeng pagdalhan ng proyekto na ito at dun siya gawin. Pero napili kami, masaya din kami na parang inire-represent din namin yung community namin at ang Pilipinas.
Sana hindi na siya luluwa pa.
You're not necessarily building a typology. Buildings are not just buildings, they're a process. So the structure and the way it was created, all that needs to be flexible enough to transform and live with the community. So that over time, it might become something different. But at least it's been, it belongs to that process and belongs to them.
It's the natural thing to happen for social beings to come together and really pull through as a group. The power of the collective is greater than individuals alone. So there is this natural synergy which happens when people come together and create something which none of them could do on their own.
Jangan